When I asked for clarification, where in the code does it say this, I was referred to the table B1. And the footnote on the bottom of table B1 was what was used to say that this is what, this is why it's the net, not the gross, and that. I don't agree. I'm using the words that are in this. It basically refers us to 334A2. When I go to 334A2, what I find is the information about the reductions for steep slopes. It goes into detail of how to do it and all of that. And the only place that mentions coverage in that is paragraph D, which is pertaining to if you have semi-pervious, that can be taken into consideration in considering coverage for reducing it, that it's not as bad. You might be allowed to have more than what the code limits it to. That's the only place the coverage is in that section of the code. And when that refers to coverage, it refers to gross lot area. So it didn't really give me the warm and fuzzy. Now I see the section of the code explains why we're using the gross lot area instead of net, or the net instead of gross. There was also concern expressed that this was new in 2010, and I just wanted to make sure it's really clear. This was the continuation using 1989 when it was passed. This is all a continuation of that law that was developed then, continuing in through our 2010 readoption of the code. And when you look at the two, the wording is not exactly the same, but it's the exact same intent. Same percentages, same way of doing the things. The next thing we got was a memorandum, again from the village planner, effectively kind of challenging what we represented in one of the memos. Her first point was that nothing that happened before 2010 can count as a precedent, which I don't think makes sense. And the second thing, and this is where I have problem just with the understanding of what the intent of the statement is. She referred to each of the ones that we had identified as places where we had used gross lot area, and suggesting that this was actually demonstration of the precedent of how it has been done for the whole time. And what it said is, based upon the regulations listed in section 300-34A2, this project did not require steep slope deductions. Therefore, the building coverage could be calculated with the gross lot area. What it sounds like to me is you're allowed to use the gross lot area on properties where it's not required to consider the steep slopes. There's nothing in the code that says where you'd require that and where you wouldn't. I think it's all the same thing. You always are considering steep slopes, but you're considering steep slopes for the purpose that was written for, which is whether or not it's a building lot, not for coverage of buildings or impervious surface. Obviously, this property, and I'm about halfway through actually, so it should be quick. This property, as you guys know, is in a very steeply sloped part of the village. It's an unusual part of the village. It's a part of the village that is typified by its craggy rocks and the character of the houses. It's one of the nicest parts of the village in many different ways. When we look at the configuration of the lots in that area, we can see how the road had to wind up because of the hills. We can see that the houses are they're not rectangular lots. They were lots defined by how the steep slopes work. And we did an analysis of that to compare our lot with those other lots and compare what size house we were proposing to what the others are. That was submitted. We showed you the analysis. We considered all of the houses in the context limits area, expanding that a little bit so it was a little bit more realistic of that neighborhood, because 200 feet away from the subject property could be just one parcel. We actually went to what you'd say, well, here's the neighborhood. And so far, there's been no objection to how we did that. I don't think it benefits us or detracts from us. It's just, I think, the right way to do it. And what we came up with was our house at 5,038 square feet kind of fits into the mix of the houses in that neighborhood. Our lot is smaller. Of the 7 that we considered as the immediate neighbors, this lot is smaller than 4, and it's larger than 2. I think that's the right number. Yeah, so I still am saying that this fits in with what it is. It's a house that's designed to fit with that neighborhood. The gross we did another memo that analyzed the gross and net coverage calculations for the building lots, and in there we kind of confirmed what the actual code says, which I'm sure you guys have read, but it's just important. When you go look at building coverage, it does not say net lot area. When you look at impervious coverage, it says gross lot area. When you look at how it defines lot coverage, the amount of building coverage, impervious surface coverage, or a combination of the two, divided by the lot area and expressed as a percentage. It doesn't say of the net lot area. And in a code like this, that's important, particularly when you've defined net lot area and gross lot area in the code. Maybe that's a deficiency in the code, but what I've been told, I'm not an attorney, don't know what the real rules are, but that in something like that, if it's considered vague, it has to go to the benefit of the property owner. You can't say, well, it's really vague, so we're going to decide it this way and penalize the property owner. Again, in this, there's only one mention of a type, and that's impervious coverage. I think that's correct. I think it should have included that in the building, but it doesn't say it. But it doesn't say the opposite. Now, I've got a bunch of these. I'm only going to do, I think, 2 of them because I sent it to you in the one of the memos that we prepared. We looked at projects that we did in town, and we analyzed if we used the gross lot area, if the implication in the village planner's memo is that these other parcels did not require steep slopes analysis, the logic is, well, you go and you look at the property, it's flat. Why would you require people to do it? So we took a look at some of these and said, well, is that a viable way that it works? 31 Russell Place, a lot area of 9,574 square feet, a deduction for slopes of 2,241 for a net lot area of 6,333. Building footprint approved and built, 2,570 square feet. The permitted coverage, 27%. Gross area coverage, our calculation, 26.84. We're 0.16% under, but we're under. If we run that with the coverage for net area, it's 40.6%. Certainly not something, well, it's just a little smidge they didn't notice. This is a property that is very steeply sloped. Now, when you look at the front of it, you could say, well, it doesn't look like it's sloped. When you look from down below, you realize that the first floor is 3 stories in the air. Very complicated house to do. It got tremendous review by the planning board. And the fact is, it's a very steeply sloped house. It required no variances. It required no waivers or anything like that. I'll skip these easy ones. But some of actually, I'll just do this one. This is over on McClellan, minimum 5,000 square foot building lot. Very typical of a lot of our neighborhoods in Dobbs Ferry. Lots of lots that are just at the minimum. Somebody subdivided, it says 5,000 is the rule. I'm going to subdivide them into rectangles 5,000 square feet. No deduction taken for steep slopes. Coverage calculated on the basis of the gross lot area. Deduction for slopes, only 218 square feet, but still that makes it 4,782 square feet with a building footprint of 1,322, where 27% coverage is permitted. With gross, we're 26.44%. If we're doing net, we're 27.8% and over. Would have required a variance, some kind of consideration by this board or the planning board. Let me go to one that's very recent. That was pretty interesting. So this is Cyrus Place. This is back off of Northfield. It's basically an enormous hillside. Cyrus Place, the lot area, which was they actually re-subdivided the whole hill. They combined 4 lots into one. So they had a lot area of 18,750 square feet. The deduction for slopes was 8,298. The building footprint was 2,855, and the permitted coverage in the area is 20%. With the gross area, the coverage is 15.23%. That was approved, and that's what was built. Using the coverage with net area, it would be 27.3%, 7.3% over what is permitted. I don't think the building department made any mistake. I think they understood that, and this is how they were doing it. And the 7.3% is similar to what we're looking at up on North Mountain Drive. 18% of the gross lot area we're 100% compliant. Doing it as net, we need the variance. I don't think that really makes sense, and that's why we're here. I'm not going to go through these because you don't need those because you've already seen them. Only mentioning there are a tremendous number of properties in town that have steep slopes. Just because I had nothing better to do late one night, what I did is I just took some topos from the GIS of Dobbs Ferry. This is Northfield Avenue, lot after lot after lot, at minimum size with steep slopes. Every one of those houses is non-compliant if you're using the net lot area. This is going to Briary, Hickory Hill Road, Manor Place, Mohican Park, Judson Avenue, Bel Air Drive, which is Villard Hill. Villard Hill is a fabulous place to live. It's a really beautiful community. Lots of steep, so there are very nice people who live up on Villard Hill. I'll try and be a little bit less obnoxious. The topography of it is all about the steep slopes, and the houses that have been built there do a very good job, much like what we're proposing to do on North Mountain Drive. We submitted a complete set of plans for this application to the planning board. I know they're questioning whether they reviewed that as the house instead of a house. I don't think there's any way that this can be considered a review of a house, given the specificity of the engineering that was necessary. It has to be the review of the house that's proposed for this lot. Those are the drawings that we submitted. Here's the site plan that we submitted for that. And then this is the one that we submitted last September. If you look at the two, there are differences. They're not dynamic, and the coverage numbers are consistent from the two. Again, looking at this neighborhood, the character that it has, which is very different from what we normally think of when we drive around Dobbs Ferry. You drive down Maple Street, you drive through any of the towns in the Flatter area. In the Flatter area, you'll see this kind of a land use pattern. You don't see that up in this area. It begs a different approach, and that's what we've tried to do with this house. We've tried to design a house that works with this property, that works with this topography, that works with these neighbors, that's consistent with what's effectively the driveway to the country club. This would be a really nice house to drive by. The concerns that have been expressed to us by potential neighbors is, are we going to do a builder spec house that's going to deteriorate from the value of the property? You saw that kind of go on with one of the recent houses that was done up there. There were concerns that it just wasn't of the caliber of that neighborhood. I think this house is going to be a very good house for that neighborhood. It fits really well with the property. As one of the planning board members said when this issue came up, when all of a sudden maybe it's too big, and that crazy, what, it's too big? Is it too long? Is it too high? Is it too wide? No, mathematically it's too big because it doesn't comply with this number if you use this as what you're dividing by instead of that. That's not how you judge whether this house fits in. It's just not appropriate. So what we've done is designed a house that we think is going to really work nicely in that neighborhood, and I was as quick as I could be.
Pretty good.
Thank you. But I'm not the only person speaking. So, and I'm not the lawyer, so I think this has to go into the world of law now. So I'll sit down and stop talking.
Good evening, Chairman. Kristen Wilson from the law firm Marks, G. Palmero and Wilson. Nice to be back before you. Patty summed up a lot of our points quite well in the PowerPoint presentation. I guess two kind of more legal points that I just wanted to raise, since you are a quasi-judicial board, are two things. One is that you're sitting here tonight in really two capacities. We have two pending applications. The first of which involves an interpretation. And I guess what I would remind this board of, I'm sure you're well aware of it, is that you grant variances, you look at interpretations, but you don't legislate. And you can't. And the case law is clear that when you start to legislate, when you start to read things in that are not in the code, that's a legislative act, and you can't do that. Here, as Mr. Steinschneider has presented before, and I think I have raised before, we respectfully suggest that maybe the Board of Trustees needs to go back and amend the code to make it more clear if the intent and the purpose was to calculate whether it's lot coverage or a lot of other calculations based on net lot area rather than gross. But here, to interpret and basically legislate that the definition includes the word net when it doesn't is beyond your authority. It's just not there. It's not within the scope of what you can review and what you can determine. The other kind of legal aspect that I wanted to raise tonight, and I used to sit up there with you, with the boards back in early 2000s, I think my last meeting here was probably 2013, 2014. And this issue it was never an issue. It was the definition, you applied the definition as written. Certainly was here when you were beginning to do the revamp of the code, was part of that process. And although there was no litigation, there's no judicial decision on how lot coverage is calculated or building coverage. You basically applied the words as written in the code. So I can stand up here from a different point of view, knowing that at least for years, it was interpreted and applied as the gross lot area, not net. But the other legal principle, or not so much a legal principle, but the other consequence of a determination like this is of the non-conformities that you would automatically create, not just with the examples that Mr. Steinschneider stated that clearly would have or should have or could have required variances, but for the host of other properties we haven't gone through all the calculations for, that you have been building for, I would submit, decades, 30, 40 years, allowing permitting applications to be approved and built with one way of applying lot coverage. And if you just immediately change that, you've now created a host of non-conforming properties. So if you just wanted to come back in and put a deck on your property, you might have to come in and get variances now, even though when you built the house, you were well below the lot coverage, and you thought, hey, I could put a garage or a deck or some other accessory structure and still be well compliant in the bulk regulations of the village code. But now all of a sudden, you're back and you're like, wait a second, I need a 15, 20, 30% variance to do something, for all intents and purposes, was compliant when there hasn't been a change. There is no vested right in the zoning code. You can change the zoning code. The legislative body in every municipality can do that, and you're subject to that. That just hasn't occurred here. So, and I'm speaking only towards the interpretation part right now. And I think procedurally, unless this board wants to take the issues kind of in a different order, I think procedurally, it would be helpful to have, to know whether or not the building inspector's interpretation is going to be upheld or overturned. Obviously, if it's overturned, we don't need the variance. If it's upheld, I'm happy to go through the 5 factors. And I know it's a public hearing. I don't know if there's people out there or here that want to speak. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Could I just ask, I agree we can't legislate, but why, in your view, would we be legislating and overstepping our authority if we said that lot area means gross lot area, but, because it doesn't say gross or net. So don't we have to, one way or the other, exercise some authority to choose one of those 2 options?
So there are 2 reasons why. The answer is yes. It's silent on it. But if you look at the past practice of the village, it's been gross. We've shown that. Even before 2010, I mean, the regulations didn't change. So that demarcation of 2010, anything prior to that, you don't consider it. That I don't agree with that either. I know Patty mentioned that. but the provisions have remained the same. So you look, so it's vague. So you look at past practice, and there's also, so therefore the precedent there, but there's also, and I've submitted it, put it in several of my letters, that when the language is vague, the courts have found that you must rule in favor of the property owner. And here, it's vague, but yet the village has consistently interpreted and applied. I'll use interpreted in air quotes because I don't think this board has ever considered an interpretation of this code provision, but certainly has applied gross. So for those,
I'm not sure you can say it consistently did that. I think you can say that it consistently did that before 2010. There haven't been any cases brought to my knowledge after that date. You know, we've had two building inspectors, you know, over the last 10 years or so, and I don't believe that there is anything recent that interpreted such that where there were steep slopes, the net numbers were not used and they were compliant net-wise.
But we got approvals where if it had been net, would have needed a variance. And the approval was granted based on coastline area years ago.
so Cyrus Place, Florence Avenue, Belden Avenue, and DeVoe Street, those were all examples. We put in our original submission in that the planner said for a variety of reasons, one way or another, you should differentiate them. Those were all post-2010. So we would have required variances, as Mr. Steinschneider stated, had the net lot area been applied. So I will correct my statement. I can't say it was 100% across the board consistent with gross. What I can tell you is that we have empirical evidence. We have provided this board and this village now with a dozen, let's say, maybe more examples where gross was applied, and had net been applied, you would have had a lot more applications on your agenda for variances.
Can I just ask a question? In all of those circumstances where gross was applied, did any of them have steep slopes that weren't
Yes.
deducted?
Yes, that's what I just showed.
Because a number of the ones that you provided, to my understanding, had no steep slopes. And they had, and by the standards, they just used gross.
The first, what I did, writing that, I just, off the top of my head, I wrote out 20 properties that I knew, I could look at the plans quickly and say, yeah, we use coast lot area. Maybe a third or a half of those would be fine with whichever one you used. The other half, and that was just off the top of my head, they would all need variance. And since then, what we've done, we've actually, not only have we gotten 30 of the projects done from 2010, that were done with gross lot area, not net area, and with required it. Also solicited input from other people who've done for the village. Christina Griffin's house is up on the top of Avenue. Both of those were gross lot area. It was a contentious kind of consideration. The one that's a little bit further down the street, like Appleton, would have required variances if they used the net. They used the gross or we tried to come up with 100 properties in Dobbs-Ferry in the last 10 years, whether it's additions or whether it's new construction, whatever, that use the gross lot area, is steep slopes on the property. One of the challenges, and Dan, I'm sure you understand it, Dan Homer does better than I do, right? But we're talking about steep slopes in Dobbs-Ferry. We're rivaling like a level sidewalk. We're talking about 15%, which is 1.5 feet. You know, in 10 feet, it's not. You wouldn't, if you're running around, it'd be a little tough on a baseball field, but most of the time it's considered a relative level. 25% is still 2.5 feet. It's not like a big slope. It's not steep in many ways. It was developed for reasons that have nothing to do with this. Completely not intended to have any impact on coverages, as evidenced by the actual minutes when that was adopted. That we were corrected on that in the minutes. We submitted those minutes. That it's done for the purposes of calculating the number of lots you get in a subdivision, or as the case that I was applying for at that time.
Just say what you got.
Sorry, Peter. instructed how we had to do it and how to apply it. We were not limited in our coverage. We were permitted to have full property coverage, no deduction for steep slopes. We were required to do the steep slopes, determine how many building lots we could have, we determined how many of the, how many of the building lots could be converted into condominium. That's why that was in place. If there's a feeling that there needs to be something that reduces the size of houses, then the board of trustees needs to deal with that, need to take evidence of what would be the ramifications of that, given the fact that whole streets of houses now be declared existing non-conforming. Not the desirable situation in this village, Williams Hills, and these really nice neighborhoods with a character.
I agree with what you said. This board knows, we all know, it's not within our power to legislate. Question in my mind is, are we legislating if we approve it or disapprove it? And it seems to be a difference, not only of judgment, but of fact. We're getting from our building inspector a statement which says basically that we need to calculate our net. We're getting from our village planner a statement which says that for the last 15 years, it's been calculated, the land use based on the net area, which will always suggest that if we were to approve this one, we would be stepping out of the procedures laid out by our building department and by our planner and by our recent practices. So I guess I'm confused as to that difference of opinion, as to whether the 20 properties you cite were based on gross or based on net. Because the letter, as I read the letter from the village planner, it seemed to me that in those cases, the calculation was based on gross because there was no steep slope adjustment.
It's more interesting than, if you look at the real words, it's the kind of thing, actually, I think I get accused of writing. You know, it makes a point, but it's kind of a somewhat strange point that's being made. Again, 40 Devo, which was approved 2 years ago. Based upon the regulations listed in section 300-34A2, this project did not require steep slope deductions. Therefore, the building coverage could be calculated with the gross lot area. Now, what do you draw from that? You assume, well, there are no steep slopes that needed to be deducted, right?
Exactly.
Well, if we go to that property, I can get back to there. Oh, going the wrong way, sorry. So if I go back to Devo, that's the very last one. Devo, the lot area is 11,508, 663 square foot deduction for steep slopes. Net lot area, 10,845. Building footprint, 3,046 square feet. Permitted coverage, 27%. Lot coverage using gross area, 26.5%. Coverage with net area, 28.1%. Were they just saying it's so small, it doesn't matter?
So,
I don't think so.
hi, do I have to like introduce myself? Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Sam Giussaniano, I'm a planning analyst. I work with Valerie, the village planner. I'm pretty sure what we were referring to in this memo was the part of the code right at the end of 30-34A2, section C. It says sloped areas with a horizontal dimension of less than 5 feet and/or an area of less than 150 square feet may be considered an anomaly by the planning board and not deducted with site area as otherwise required above. So I'm pretty sure the building inspector can attest that that's probably why these deductions were not
was
accounted
issued a
for.
waiver, right.
Yeah, so it can be.
We didn't get a waiver. We did not get any waivers, we got no variances, and we submitted a site plan that showed the steep slopes, which is 600, the deduction was 600 and something square feet. That means it was around 2,400 square feet, or 25% of the lot was sloped over 15%.
That's
I wouldn't want, I know Dan is a very careful person who's very meticulous in the way he does his job. He wouldn't walk out there and say, you know what, I'll just let it go. Not his personality at all.
No matter what all of you are saying, that application did not come before this board requesting a variance for
Right.
these issues.
Right.
So we did not rule on that one way or another, which makes my assumption was that it met the requirements of the code in the manner where it didn't require a variance. Otherwise, I guess we could say we've all been hoodwinked.
Wait, but-
Or
but
we
do
can,
you-
say- or we can say that there were certain aspects about that project that made it approvable.
No,
Where,
it was
where the village was gaining something, and so they gave something.
Only, that would have to be,
Or
Why?
through a waiver,
because I've been doing this for a long time, and I have a tough time making that argument. I gotta really prove it. And any board out there before that says, well, we're gonna do that, and you're gonna give that, we want that in writing, we want it clarified, we want it up front. No, Dobbs Ferry is.
No, but it's in the plans. I'm speaking about it in the plans.
but
Yeah, in the plans, we show the slopes. In the plans, we analyze.
But you show the structure you're building.
Sure, but.
Right.
But if we're using, if the net lot area was used at that time in the village, there would have been a determination that we were exceeding the permitted coverage. They may have granted us a waiver if I could prove some way that, you know what, we can't do it the other way, but that never came up, and I don't think that was a project where I wanted to make use of the attic by adding a couple of dormers.
But-
We were shut down on that.
so the calculations shown to the building department were based, in that one example, but again, several, since 2010, based on gross. So again, I forget who asked I think maybe the threshold question or a critical question is, you're being asked to determine whether or not building inspector's determination is accurate. And here, given what we've shown to be past practice, we have yet to see evidence of any plan pre-2010 or post-2010 where, other than ours right now, and maybe since we've started this process, but certainly I feel like we're the guinea pig here, where net lot area was used. I haven't seen anything substantiating the building inspector's determination. So based on, maybe not 100% certainty, but somewhat consistent past practice that we've shown, and the vagueness that you are required to interpret in favor of the property owner, I think you almost have to say that it's based on gross lot area.
And actually, to go to Chris' point, Dan actually has been requiring other properties to use net lot area in the last 2 years.
I think further back than that.
Dan wasn't in charge.
When I spoke to the previous building inspector, he said he did it the same way on that lot area.
It says right on our plan, what's the gross. Those are the calculations, but not obscure.
So
How many square feet are we talking about in terms of the house? Like,
On this
by
lot?
these two different calculations.
23,237 square feet is the gross lot area, 15,716 is the net.
Okay, but talking about the square footage of the, like, the coverage.
4,002 square foot rent versus, I think, 2,600.
wait, I don't know if you were hearing the question. Can you just repeat the question again? I think he's asking a different, okay, all right.
And one of the objectives here in this neighborhood is we've got a garage, we've got a three-car garage. Take a three-car garage, it's about, say, 1,000 square feet. Out of that 2,600 square foot, it gives you 600 house. Not something impossible to build, certainly. I've done houses that are as small as 1,200 feet, 1,000 square feet on New Road. If that's the market for the need or the purpose or whatever, great, this is not this neighborhood. I know it wasn't allowed to be in evidence tonight, but I've seen a letter that basically that they submitted to the village that is from a property owner up there whom I do not know, who's very concerned with the decision this board makes. He has no problem with you granting the approval of this house, be beneficial to the neighbors' values, very concerned with all of a sudden if we're being required to build a smaller house. As I said earlier, many of the calls I got when people said, I saw you're doing this thing, what are you planning to build? You're gonna be a builder's spec house, you're gonna be cheap. What seemed to go from a point in the beginning, there was lots of consternation about this, to the point that neighbors joined together and hired engineer, that's a really hired an engineer. To question the project, that's all dropped away. That didn't drop away because how small we're building the house. That dropped away because they appreciated the quality of house.
The other point is the steep slopes. Your regulations are to protect the steep slopes. This house, the building envelope, we've engineered it so it's on the flat portion of the lot. You know, we're protecting the steep slopes. Environmentally, this goes maybe more to the variance criteria, but there is an environmental benefit. We're containing the stormwater runoff on site. We've agreed to put in curbing. I don't want to speak for my client, but there are other reasonable conditions or aspects. We're here to work with you. We're just, you know, we planned this house based on gross lot area. It wouldn't require a variance. It was, for all intents and purposes, we believed to be zoning compliant with, you know, we did get a variance the last meeting to make this a building lot, to allow this to be a building lot. But we have engineered this site so the site works. The neighbors are in favor of it. There's not opposition. The one concern about stormwater runoff, we've had 2 engineers say, yes, it works.
Not our engineer hired by the
Right.
neighbor.
So 3 engineers, really. An independent engineer from the property owners, village as well as ours. So we believe this is a good thing for the village. We think that maybe there needs to be a legislative amendment or something to make it clear, but that this house actually fits in the neighborhood. So that's why we are adamant and very passionate about letting you know how not only the history and the past practice of the village should allow this to give you some comfort that this is going to work, but also that, you know, everyone seems to be in support of it. There
Well,
aren't-
I'm not sure you can say that everyone is in support of it. You know, you have people that have told you that they don't think it's too large. I know a number of people up in that area personally, and they've told me that they do think it's too large. You know, so it's all in your point of view. You know, it's not a fact.
Well,
You also have the planning board saying it's too large.
Right.
So, which is somewhat of an interesting phenomenon, right? Because we went from that, on that board from October through January, first time anyone mentioned the size of the house.
The first time they saw our house was in January.
No.
Yes.
First time they saw the
No.
house, we submitted the plans of the house and then done.
That's not what they were saying.
Oh, maybe they need to go back and check the record.
Perhaps January was the first time they discussed it,
First time they discussed the project in November.
but I'm talking about the house.
The house was primary to the submission. We weren't doing hypothetical. We showed a house with elevation plans, a whole complete set of schematic that we refined it after this board sent us back to the planning board. Did refine it that way, which was the February meeting. But they didn't come up with the idea that it was big. They received the memo. And we saw that play out right before our eyes. We saw 3 members of the planning board, 2 of whom went so far, actually 2, still saying, I don't think it's too big. The chairman says, I don't think it's too big. Rob Lane has indicated, I don't have a problem with slot. Not sure which way Steve Rob's hand is pointing at this point, but at that February meeting, he said, I have no problem with the way this house is.
Well, he clearly said last week that he's got a big problem with the house, size of the house.
Because he introduced the idea that too big is a magical word in this context. Again, too big for what? The only thing that matters too big in this case is it's too big to work within the limits of the engineering that's required for this lot. Does it encroach upon side yard control? Does it violate the height requirement? It's compliant with everything. The only place is that anything came up on this after several months without any discussion about the gross lot area, the net lot area, which was always on the plans. On that site plan was submitted this board in September. for this board to consider in September, it had those numbers on it. So that's been there from the beginning. The only time this came up was when the village planning consultant looked at it and said, I think we're supposed to use something different. She put it in her memo.
But Pat, if you look at the houses nearby this parcel, the two houses closest to it are 2,800 square feet and 4,100 square feet.
Sure, 4,100 square feet on a significant parcel.
But where he owns another parcel. Okay, I mean,
Peter, that is what we saw in the letter. That's not what the names are different on the ownership of the two parcels. Maybe he's joining them, I don't know. But right now, his house in the town of Greenberg sits on one parcel. That house has its own identity, and he has that ownership. And right now, that is the numbers that it is. This property was part of a much larger parcel that subdivided this off. The house next door subdivided two off.
Right.
If you went up there, one of the tests I had on this is I go and I look at that whole neighborhood, and I said, okay, what kind of precedent? What's the avalanche of construction that happened up about there? Lots. Maybe 4. There's another one that's kind of around the corner. There's like 4 lots up in that whole area. Somebody could, and I don't think the people who own them now, the people owning those houses, I don't think they have any interest in selling.
Yeah,
So
but,
we're
well,
not,
but that's not the issue.
That's not the issue, yeah.
It's the issue, the issue is can they?
right. You know,
But are they developable?
their lots are big, and I wouldn't see any reason that they would be able to.
there's, we asked you to go to the planning board, as you both correctly pointed out. And planning board ruled on one item favorable to the position you had wanted, and we, by a vote of 5-0, that it was a buildable lot, even with the steep slope reductions. And we provided a variance for that. On the second measure, the planning board, by a vote of 4-1, said the house is too big for the lot. And, with it being consistent, for me at least, with the people we asked to give us guidance and advice, I have to take that vote seriously.
Sure.
I don't have to necessarily follow it, because this is a zoning board, not a planning board, but I have to respect it. So you see, I have a lineup of facts. I got a building department inspector who's saying, so the same thing as the planning board is saying, as the same thing as the planner is saying. Now, I'm gonna take at your word, and I don't disagree at all, that you can build a beautiful house in an environmentally sound way. But down the road, there's gonna be a young, clever architect who's gonna look at this property and say, you zoning board, in 2023, approve a lot coverage using the rules in effect at the time, which is, in this case example, the minimum net lot, of 30%. I'm making up the number. I don't know
Sure.
exactly what your number is, Patty. And he's gonna say, I want the same thing. And look at the precedent. So, and while your lot is large and it's got a lot of space up there, there's a lot of places in this village where the lots are smaller and where that overage would be a real impediment. So we can't zone specific, we can't, even as a variance, we be careful to do something that sets a numerical target for somebody else to do.
The
Sure.
entrance in the village act, restriction on it,
Oh,
it's not in the
Or-
code right now. It says the lot area.
it kind of sounds to me like it's unclear what the code says. And I know Christina said,
I respect the planning board and the village planner, take what Dan says in my regard. I do too. The fact that he and I have a difference of agreement on this stuff, not any way that I'm suggesting he doesn't know what he's doing. I think he's got a perception on this and how he thinks it should be. He can't insert the word net. I can't insert the word gross. The lot area, fine, the code says the lot area. Lot area is the square footage of the lot. It doesn't say that it's a net with the deduction. Deduction only comes in under 300-34A2. And what is the reality is that John Stone works with Dan, I guess. He laughed when I explained why it was, he said, you can't remember what happened. You don't know what they were thinking in 1989. And as Peter knows, I do know what was happening. I was there. I I was the next person on the agenda. I was the person that answered the question. How it's done. It was to limit the size, the number of lots that could be gotten through subdivision. It had nothing to do with building coverage. If they wanted to do that, they needed to make that clear in the code. We wrote the code. Some people did, I didn't. We wrote the code in 2010. And at that point, obviously, they weren't thinking enough about that. What are you about? They didn't say, whoa, we gotta make it really clear here. This thing has to be, if you're gonna be building a house here, you gotta use that net lot area. You can't use those sides. They just defined it all the way through. They left the word out in that one definition, building. They did put in net, they didn't put in gross.
But they did use gross when it revolves around impervious.
Yes.
Which,
yes.
okay.
You know, so that's something that is, you know, that is not reduced by steep slopes.
Right.
Right, but the other isn't.
So let's.
That's why they said lot area.
Yeah.
Right, so let's apply logic. If you're concerned about steep slopes, as defined in our code, refers to sensitive parcels, sensitive slopes to personal property. Environmental protection goal stated, I know it was something different you could do, but that's what they said. If that's the thing, why in the world would you allow gross lot area for impervious, which is the source of the storm water, and then say, yeah, but you know what? We don't want anybody to build a house that big. We're gonna say it has to be net for the house. Doesn't make sense. It would almost make sense to be the reverse.
I agree that it doesn't make sense. I agree with that, and that needs to be changed.
I think it, oh, so let's get to a really simple, guys, I have no idea. So, right now, if your primary concern was, what is that precedent going to be? And then when that clever young architect comes along, I don't know right now. What I'm seeing coming out of this is less than clever. What you're dealing with right now is the ability to define that the code is not clear. I don't think you have the right to deny it because of what the state said. They say you have to interpret it unclear. You have to interpret it into the thinking of the needs of the property owner. But then you can say, we think the planning board, I'm surprised Dan hasn't already said, maybe he already has, said to the board, we need to clear this up. He says, here, this needs to be fixed in the code. But
Right.
I really urge them before they just say, well, yeah, we're always in favor of less. Take a look at what it does to all of those other parcels.
Well, but that's what happens whenever you change zoning codes. I mean, most of the properties in Dobbs Ferry are non-compliant. That's why we exist. We wouldn't have a job were it not for that.
We don't want to write zoning ordinances as part of that.
So-
And I know, Peter, you guys get paid a fortune.
We do, with
So just-
options.
So if I,
20,000 for these guys, I get 40.
Be a little bit careful here, we don't know who's watching this, where they at.
so if I could just go to one of your concerns, and it's a fair concern, it's the precedent concern. We believe we have precedent in past practice of the village using gross. You're concerned about,
And past practice is using net.
I haven't,
Very few,
right.
not 5 years ago.
Can I just ask something? Unfortunately, I don't have the code in front of me, and I came here in a hurry, and I don't have my notes from the last meeting, but I recall, I think the last time we were discussing this, looking at something that came just before this section of the code that referred to net, and I remember asking if you could address the context, and if you recall this conversation, it would be helpful to me. I don't actually have it in front of me, so I can't point
But
you
I
to it.
think what I interpreted as, when I went back and watched the meeting, was that memo that we showed these 7 parcels that were developed through and everything, using gross lot area, where if you use the net lot area, they would have required a variance.
No, but this was something in the code itself,
I've put up some
do you have that,
definitions.
Dan?
Do we have a paper-bound code?
I have the code up if you want it.
Yeah.
What section?
I did highlight, we did include some of the definitions. I don't know if that's what we were referring to. But as Mr. Gutman's reviewing the code, if I could just have 30 seconds of your time in terms of the precedent factor, if you were to consider, putting the interpretation aside, if we're moving now into the realm of variance, we just offer a few suggestions. One, here, at least the public record shows that the neighbors are in favor, don't have concerns. We've addressed them as far as stormwater runoff. That's something that future applicant may not be able to show. We've engineered, proven by 4 different engineers, that this site can handle the lot coverage. Another thing this board could do, if you're concerned about setting a bad precedent, we would agree to reasonable conditions. We would agree to no additional variances on lot coverage. We don't need side yard variances. We don't need height. We don't need anything else. We would agree to say, okay, you're not coming back again. We'll put it in the deed. It'll be a condition, it runs with the land. We'll agree to something like that to give you comfort that in this instance, given the past practice, given the history here, given the environmental benefit, the environmentally sensitive project we're proposing, that these all create unique factors for this particular property, for this application, that I would humbly submit, given the steep slopes on this property, given the neighborhood and the context in which this house fits, you're not going to get another example like this.
So I take it you're not willing to budge on size?
We're-
Well, the biggest concern I have with that, having been, not just with you guys, but a lot of you, if somebody came to us and said, okay, here's the deal, 22% coverage is what's permitted for effectively close to what your net is. So if you could design a house with 22%, I'd like to take a look at it. The challenge I have on that is my first suggestion to my client is to give up the garage. Because he's got a 3-bedroom house, nice rooms, no doubt about it. He's got a living room, a kitchen, big kitchen, nice dining room, living room, and family room. And he's got, what factors into this, he's got an outside screen porch, which counts as building. Maybe if we cut the roof off that, we didn't have that.
Why not do that? I mean, you have 3 porches. I mean, why, I don't
Well,
understand.
having an outdoor sitting area screen porch is really nice.
It's fair, but I guess I'm missing why the screen porch counts and like paved area or the driveway doesn't count. It's like, why?
Not my fault. I would, have you, or say, we don't think it should exceed, the first floor area should not exceed, habitable area of that. We've got porch, we have a front porch, we have a side porch, we have a covered screen porch that contribute, significantly to that coverage. We have a 3-car garage, contribute significantly to that coverage. So the size of the house, the bigness of the house is not, it really isn't a big house. It really isn't. Not just up in that neighborhood. I mean, we've done houses up on Clinton Avenue that are bigger than this. Nobody complained about the size, and those were all done on the gross lot area. Again, in fairness to Dan on this, the factor in that, which I think is more often the fact, is if, actually, I'll use 60 Washington or One Myrtle. One Myrtle allowed, I think, 20,000 square foot lot, and I've got 80,000 square foot. The thing was, this, and I had to count, deduct 50%, I'm still twice the size of the required. Why go through this up? We did do it, we provided this analysis. But if your property is big enough, it just isn't, you're never gonna get 0.
So, given the size of the garage, 3-car, given the number of porches, 3, aren't there opportunities present to keep the footprint on the first floor the size you want and reduce the overall building footprint? Do you need a 3-car garage? Do you need the 3 porches? I mean, I understand, in an ideal world, this is not what the client wants, and in an ideal world, you give them all of it. But if you're looking to get approval, there are ways that you can keep the footprint of the house and reduce the overall footprint on the property.
We need to cut 1,500. That's not minimal. You know, we're allowed 26, maybe 27, I don't know that, but 402 is what it calculates as 80% of the gross lot area. And that's a number that makes sense for that zoning district. Here's the thing that I forgot to say. I'm starting to get old things I have on my list. But I don't know. Sure. Let's imagine right now, that we're saying this house is too big. We're saying this house is too big, it needs to be cut. It's very large. Well, I forget the number that came up with, 26%, I think, of, it was like 9% higher or something. So it's 26%. It's almost as much site coverage as you're permitted, the OF6 zoning district. But it's a bigger parcel, so they can go down the side. Imagine it's flat. Let's not even imagine it's flat. Let's imagine the whole site is 14.99%. You build a house. Quiet. House is no different size. It fits perfectly on the lot. I just don't have the steep slopes deduction. What is the steep slopes deduction factored in for the size of a house? It doesn't make sense. Tell me it factors in with lot coverage, you know, impervious surface area. That makes some sense to me. Telling me I have to reduce the size of the house because it's deducted makes sense. I don't think it was the intent. I think the word that got left out was gross. I think if both said gross, we could be sitting here tonight and be a better code and we understand it. And that's one of the things I think at some point the board of trustees should be taking into consideration. Clean it up and make it make sense. I'm willing to bet that I actually know because he's telling me Dan has a list. There are many things in the code that we have this kind of a, you know, what is the real, you know, we're doing this. There have been things in the code, not the way Dan's the new sheriff in town, and he's sort of a Matt Dillon like way of thinking, some others. Technically kind of Dan's very direct, and he wants to be able to go by putting words in your mouth. Would that be a fair assessment for your approach?
I'm going by what the code says in the book.
Exactly. So right now, the code doesn't say net, and if Dan thinks it should, then they should do that. If they do a study of it and they say it's going to be gross, I don't think Dan has any problem with that. As long as
But
it's what it is.
it doesn't read wrong in the code, because building coverage says lot area for a reason. Because sometimes it's off the gross, and sometimes it's off the net. The impervious surface calls out gross lot area.
Right.
Then it would say that also for building coverage. It would say impervious coverage and building coverage, if it were to. It doesn't read that way.
There's a missing word either way. The definition of building coverage needs a new word in it, whether it's net or whether it's gross, to be inserted in that code, and that's after they study the ramifications. Till then, I offer it today. You've interpreted it one way. You can't give any better evidence to the fact that it's always net than I can give that it's always gross. I'm sure you can come up with a list of projects that have been designed in the last 2 years where you've used that letter area. I know I talked to Sharp, I talked to, you know who agrees with me? Steve Tilley.
So,
So it's, you know, it's something that's vague, and then that's what I think you can hang your hat on. Say, this one, we had to give it because it was vague. We granted it. We put a note in the board of trustees, that's gotta be fixed, because we don't wanna have to go through that again. Get it fixed in the code.
we're agreeable to reasonable conditions. We're agreeing to never come back for another 0.1% of lot coverage. Things that would make this a unicorn in terms of applications before this board. I am curious, I don't know if anyone's online, or, I know this is a public hearing and we've taken up an hour of your time, but I'm happy to, again, we're happy to answer questions.
Do we have anybody in Zoom land that would like to be heard? Why don't we do it now?
And I just want to apologize, Mitch, there is one young, really
Going back,
Hello?
Person-
Oh, hi. Am I on?
Yes.
Yes, could you give us your name and address, please?
Absolutely.
record.
Michael Savali at 25 Osceola, which is around the corner before you get up to North Mountain. Wow, you guys have had a very interesting conversation, especially here as a lawyer, but I'm not going to touch on those facts. I wanted to, and thank you for taking the time. I sent in a letter, but I didn't do it in time. I wanted to talk about on the variance side too, because to me, the legal issue is what it is. But the variance is still before you, and I have a big interest, obviously, in the character and the value of the properties in our neighborhood, which is, as you know, some of the biggest and more expensive houses in the area and with big lots. I personally believe that the house fits nicely with the character of the area. And I actually am concerned that without a variance, I assume that the owner of this parcel needs to monetize it somehow. And if they don't have the variance, or they don't get the protection on the gross or net lot area, they're going to build a house. And that house is, to me, going to be very small for the area. And I think it has an adverse impact on the value of other houses, bigger houses in the area. I think there are other examples in town. If you look up at the big house in Myrtle that's subdivided and has all the small houses kind of next to the big house, that's not a good flavor. Certainly, I don't think this house would have the effect of changing the entire neighborhood. But if it's a tiny house, 2,000 square feet, I think it impacts the feeling of the neighborhood. And the other thing I think is that some of the conversations on changes to the design. There's a lot of this house that you're not going to be able to see from the street. And from what I have seen, and I followed, just because I'm interested in it, I've listened to all of the prior planning AHRB meetings and zoning board meetings on this topic. And as you well know, it's been going on for months. I have not heard one member of the public come and complain about the size. I have experience with the neighbors. As you may recall, this house had, in its subdivision, the 25 Osceola house, every single one of the neighbors that's near this Zero Mountain Drive, they were there complaining about the subdivision that the prior owner of my house did. I have not heard one member of the public come and complain about the size of this house. I'm also very comforted that there's been an exhaustive review on what are legitimate concerns from a runoff perspective. And from what I've seen, those concerns have been all met. And I commend all of the efforts that have gone into designing what is it's not a cookie cutter house. It looks nice to me. I think it fits in the slope nicely. And the comments that were made by the AHRB and the planning board have been incorporated into the site plans and the design in a way that, benefits the neighborhood, because it's, I think everyone should be very comfortable that there are no engineering issues and all the stormwater management has, been heard. So I guess I would end by saying that, this is a balancing act, obviously. And to me, I think the neighbors actually benefit from the size of the house and the granting of the variance. And unquestionably, the applicant does as well. And without the variance, I will take the opportunity in whatever public hearing occurs on, a small house to raise an issue that I think that the house is too small. A house 2,000 square feet in our area. You might find one example directly across the street, but I would suspect that a majority of the other houses leading up to North Mountain and in North Mountain itself are much closer to 5,000. And I think that that's something that this particular neighborhood actually needs, benefits the area. We don't have enough of the large houses in the large area that this zoning is for. So I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is that it for outside?
At this point, I don't know which way the board is headed towards the interpretation question or the variance. Obviously, you know, we would be happy with, just as happy with the variance as we would be with a different definition or interpretation of lot coverage.
Anybody have any feelings as to which is easier to start with?
Well, the variance gets right to the point. Interpretation question just begs another discussion.
Well, do we have anything from our council to the board as it relates to, I'm curious your view as to the question of ambiguity. I could read it and give you my opinion based upon what we've heard, but I think we should take advice from council as to the legal question to ambiguity. We've heard the applicant's view.
Well, it's not so much a legal question. I think it is a matter for the building inspector to use the code as he reasonably interprets it. And I guess you're being asked to whether or not his interpretation of the code is reasonable. You know, so.
So you don't have a
I don't
view or advice for the board as to the question of whether or not the defined terms in front of us, it would be reasonable for the board to take away or to otherwise conclude that just based upon the argument that there's ambiguity in the 5 defined terms in front of us, you don't have a view one way or the other?
No, but if you do find that it's ambiguous, as Ms. Wilson is suggesting, then you would tend to favor the applicant, so that it wouldn't be,
Yeah.
have a loss based on that.
What are you saying that I'm hearing you say you don't think there's ambiguity? Or are you saying there's no ambiguity because at the end of the day, it's up to the judgment of the building inspector?
Yeah, no, I don't have, it is up to the building inspector. That is his judgment.
Do you see anything in the code that offers support for interpreting the correct reading as net versus gross?
Just the way Dan has explained it. And he's applied it, he's indicated that the prior building inspector has applied it the same way. You know, no matter, we can go back and forth which lots, you know, are consistent with this and which aren't, as Patty was suggesting, you know, the gross and net. But I think the precedent is established in the manner in which the building department has dealt with this for the past, I don't know how many years, as long as Dan's here and the prior building inspector.
So I guess if I'm hearing all this correctly, what I take from that is that there is ambiguity in the text itself, like forgetting, you know, the building inspector's interpretation. But if all we're looking at is the words of the provision, there's ambiguity because it could mean either one. And if the law, in fact, is as represented and says we have to resolve that in favor of the applicant, I think that points us in that direction.
And I think Dan has taken the position, I don't want to speak for him, that it's not the greatest code provision. It's that there
Well, that's
are-
why it's ambiguous.
there are
I mean,
difficulties.
Yeah, I guess, Dan,
If it was better, there wouldn't be any ambiguity.
Yeah.
do you struggle, I mean, in your mind, is there gray area here? Or are you 100% certain that as you read the code and you stepped into this job and you inherited an interpretation, are you 100% certain that you're reading the code correctly and that in your mind there is no ambiguity here?
I do believe I am.
Okay.
Going back to the legal question for a second. In a lot of the contract work I did in government, the more stringent requirement prevailed if there was a conflict. In this particular case, is Ms. Wilson correct that the more lenient requirement or the requirement more favorable to the landowner prevails?
That is correct.
Okay.
Needless to say, you know, if you know, you can take you could just let, you know, suggest it at the end. You want to look at the variance itself, based on the interpretation. Grant the variance, then you don't have to get to the interpretation as far as making a specific finding. You just grant the variance if you're so inclined, with, I think, some message to the trustees to to look at this.
I'm inclined to see it that way too, that we avoid the interpretation issue and go straight to the variance issue, just.
The request for the variance only exists though because of the question as to the
Right.
interpretation. So how do we do one without the other?
Well, I think you're following what the building inspector has done. He's issued an opinion here. You're saying, okay, if we accept that, if we understand that to be the proper interpretation of the code, then is this applicant entitled to a variance based upon the application and so forth?
We're deferring to others when it comes to the interpretation.
I think
or-
going that way, accepting the interpretation and determining the variance is more protective of the village's interests.
Or let me just, I'm trying to problem solve with you. If it's procedurally better, we get a pretty strong indication the variance would be granted, whatever bells and whistles you would want to put on it. Well, we can withdraw our request to overturn the request for the interpretation. So you don't even have to rule on it. Put it aside. I don't know if the board wants to.
Rule on it to establish
I think by,
a basis from going forward.
It-
That the village could decide to change, but at least we're supporting the interpretation that the DOB is currently working with. And if either Dan wants to raise with the Board of Trustees further clarification, that's fine, but at least we've set down a marker which says, we're going to support our Department of Buildings, we're going to support their interpretation, and we're going to consider a variance.
That's fine. I'm just giving you options that
Thank you. Appreciate
well,
it.
if the board's uncomfortable making a decision one way or the other on the definition issue, we'll withdraw that. You don't have to decide it. Leave it for another day.
I mean, what I was gonna say to that was that, by acting on a variance, you're de facto saying the code is right.
Sure,
you know.
sure.
Or
You're
it's
absolutely
been-
right.
It's been construed correctly by the building
Yeah,
inspector.
that's a fair point.
But it's not settled.
Right.
But it's,
But that requires a legislative act by the Board of Trustees.
yeah, I guess part of the problem I have is, because of the ambiguity and almost contradictoriness of the code, as relates to impervious coverage, which is based on gross, which to me is the most ridiculous.
Right.
It makes this variance, were we to approve it, really egregious because, you've got this monstrous rock formation that is atypical of anywhere else in town, except this neighborhood. And, that's not counted at all. And so it makes granting a big variance, for me, a real stretch. So,
And it's big,
oh, it's huge.
17 to 25%.
It's as big as a garage,
On a square
if
foot.
not more.
That's where I was going in terms of pull back on the porches, go to a two-car garage, then it starts to get tenable. Then it starts to get, then the delta becomes a little bit more.
Right, and-
Wrap your mind around something.
And we're not talking about a small house.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
just talking about a house that conforms more.
Yeah, it's a 4,000 square foot footprint, which is one
With
floor.
5,000.
It-
So it's one of the things here, and I've been before, whatever this new thing is. Still haven't figured that out
That's
really.
not a good idea.
What I've found big, in fact, Alan Hale, who's on the planning board, actually said the opposite of what I would ever think anybody would say. He said, so if you got 2,600 square foot footprint, house. Now, the last thing in the world that my experience with that board ever accept is that box of a house. So we've tried to do in this house is break it into digestible pieces, where it has a nice scale, roof comes down to the top of the first floor plate. It sets in, it picks up the architecture of houses across the street, not that. It works with that. That works if you have space to spread it out, if you're building it all in one block. It's actually the reverse of the intent of the village, is this idea of minimize the footprint. How about you minimize how big it looks? I've got the houses we did up in Irvington. list that says, number one on that list has to be the ADU. How we're handling, I can't go to the widow Leanne's house and live tonight. I have to, gotta solve a number of problems.
How big is the variance if you lose a garage?
If we lose the garage, I think the entirety of the garage?
No.
A
no,
bay?
No, one bay.
You'd be taking basically, let's say it's 12 by 2. Be taking, let's say it's 2,400 feet. 240, 240. You know, it's like 0.5%. I mean, 1% would be,
0.5% of the variance?
Right.
yeah.
But, I mean, we can, the proposal, I guess, before you, the application, we're not looking to reduce, I guess, the exercise, if you wanted to go down that road, what is the problem we're trying to solve for? Again, like, we could.
A precedent-setting huge variance.
And what does the board feel about the precedent? First of all, you have a very unique record here in terms of the need or the request for an interpretation on the vagueness of a code, and then understandably, maybe some hesitation in addressing that issue. But now you have that, a variance because of that in front of you. Again, we wouldn't, if you use gross lot area, we wouldn't be here. The environmental benefit, at least this record, the ones that and I can't speak to conversations, Chairman Hoffman, you've had with others, but at least members of the public that have written in and spoken are all in support. We are agreeing to other reasonable conditions. You can put, we will put a deed restriction. We'll put it as a condition of the variance. No additional variances shall be granted for perpetuity. We're agreeing to do those things to make this so unique that you won't have this precedent concern going forward. And I think also the record it does reflect, and you can put it in the minutes, put it in the resolution granting a variance, that there has been precedent, I want to say on both sides, fine, but there's been certainly past practice that we've shown and put into the record that gross lot area was used, and this variance simply allows the property to be built as if gross lot area was used in lot coverage. That's,
It would be very different, I think, if you're trying to say we need variance from being allowed to build gross lot area.
Right.
You were saying we're gonna be 20% of the gross lot area, I think that's a whole different thing. We started at the beginning, we looked at everything, we interpreted what our opinion, what it says, we designed that, designed the house that fit the 18% of the gross lot area. It's actually 76% of that. So it's something that consists of all those examples. I mean, like, if you've got 27%, seldom designing at 21%. It's gonna be 24% by 2088. Now, that's the nature of those smaller lots. Even in this is a half-acre parcel, which is part of the problem. When this was subdivided, the logical thing would have been to say, I know it's the district, but the nature of the neighborhood is such, give up some more of the land, make this 35,000. Now, I'd love to buy 25 feet of the neighbor's property side, ban it and obviate the question. You know, and I think if I was thinking that those lots, flanking them, gonna be developed with houses close in with them, I might feel very different about it, but if those lots ever get developed, that house is gonna be nowhere near this. So it's a safe project, one that's gonna be always nice. So, well, that sets the precedent. Now they come
Yeah,
in, that guy builds a house on that 80,000 square foot house, lot mix.
so it's really like, but for the vagueness in the code, we wouldn't be here. So I think those criteria, the totality of the circumstances here, the really puts this application in its own category that we won't see again. So I would humbly submit that, if you don't want to address, again, if you don't want to address the interpretation issue, fine. We're equally happy to have a conditioned variance with a very unique record to support it. And to protect you, I get the precedent concern. But if you actually do the research and look at how unique this application is, for lack of a better term, it is the unicorn. It is, and you have the neighbors in support.
What do you legal guys think?
That's how we think.
Yeah, it's interesting, the architects on one side, the lawyers on the other.
Can I ask a question? Sorry to interrupt. This is Jessica Galen. I'm the trustee liaison to the board, and I would never weigh in typically, except that, of course, the Board of Trustees has been mentioned a number of times tonight, with regards to, this being something that perhaps we'll have to look at. Dan, do you, just in a very straightforward manner, I know that Patty, and I'm sorry, I don't know the person at the mic right now. I'm sorry, I can't see your name. Hi. I know you've given a number of examples where you have asserted that the gross lot area has been applied previously. I was just curious, Dan, given that you feel that the previous building department head and yourself have always interpreted this to mean net lot area, do you agree with any of the examples that have been given that in fact gross lot area has been applied during, I don't know if it's your tenure or Ed's, despite the sort of inherited sense that net was intended here in the code?
No, I don't think, I think it was always done using the net when the steep slope came into, when you had to use steep slope, and sometimes, I don't know what happened at the planning board, if it was a small one, if they issued a waiver or anything, but this is the way it's always been done, using the net.
So you would dispute the sort of assertions that have been made that gross has been applied since the steep slopes system was implemented?
Yeah, the ones that we went through, it was done on net lot area if it was steep slope and gross if it wasn't.
Including the examples that have been given by Patty and his colleague.
I didn't,
But
that wasn't on
some
my
of them
list.
were not examined fully because they were before 2010.
Correct.
I think Dan's on good grounds on all the properties after that.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
No, but it changed the analysis that was done or not done. Not from you, from the planner.
So since steep slopes was implemented, you feel that 100% have been interpreted, that have come up in this manner, that they've all been interpreted as, it has always been, the net principle has been applied in all of them?
Yes.
Thank you.
The calculations reviewed show differently. You would have received other variances, but
Like I said, I didn't review that one, but I don't know if there was a waiver issued or, I didn't see the steep slope for that.
I would remember if they were.
I don't think it makes sense to debate this particular point. You've got an opinion, Dan has his facts. Let's just, I think we have to accept that. Because he's the buildings, and you're the architect.
I'm not an architect, don't get me in trouble.
And I think we have to accept, I'm willing to accept that Dan has been consistent in how he's interpreted, and his interpretation is it's a net, so it's a steep slope. And we could, and frankly, I don't see any reason to continue with that debate. I think you then legitimately have a request for a variance. And we have to decide whether you meet the variance criteria. I don't know whether anybody else agrees with me. I don't know how we should vote, what we should vote on. Peter, that's why you sit in the big chair. That's why you get 40,000, we get 20.
No, I think you're right. Let's go over the 5 criteria, you know, and try and talk them out and see where we are. Who knows them?
Walk us through.
Come on,
I do have to
lead the discussion, Dan. No,
Right, so,
no, we're gonna do it, sorry.
all right.
This is our discussion.
So I'll just read each one. These are specific from Village Law 7712B.
Yeah.
The considerations of when you're reviewing an area variance, an application for an area variance. Says the zoning board of appeals shall take into consideration the benefit to the applicant if the variance is granted as weighed against the detriment to the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood or community by such grant. So in making that determination, you consider the following: whether an undesirable change will be produced in the character of the neighborhood or a detriment to nearby properties will be created. Should you want me to just go through them?
Yeah.
Okay. Second one is whether the benefits sought by the applicant can be achieved by some method feasible for the applicant to pursue, other than an area variance. In other words, what can they do without it, without the variance? Whether the requested area variance is substantial. Whether the proposed variance will have an adverse effect or impact on the physical or environmental conditions in the neighborhood or district. And whether the alleged difficulty was self-created, although that's minor.
Right.
And you've heard, testimony from folks in the neighborhood and discussions of how, at least how the applicant sees the project as being a benefit.
In the legal interpretation, if, not saying that this is the case here, if 3 of the criteria are satisfied but 1 isn't, do we have to deny it, or is it preponderance?
You're weighing it.
We're weighing it, okay.
You're weighing all of the considerations, and which, do you feel some are stronger than others, as part of the application?
Seems to me the biggest one to get over is the size of it, right? How substantial it is. It's more substantial than we've probably said yes to in a long time, as long as I've been around. The neighborhood thing is a tricky one, because what we're hearing is that if we don't grant it, then we might be affecting the character of the neighborhood by allowing a house that's substantially smaller than other houses. That's, in terms of getting the benefit without the variance, they're gonna go with a smaller house, and they'll sell it for a little bit less, but they'll still sell it, right? Seems to me, so.
This is for the property owner.
Okay, fair enough. I struggle with do we, in terms of setting precedent, do we get over the substantial size of the variance by determining that it's right for the neighborhood? It's still okay for this neighborhood.
So I agree with John completely. And I guess, Dan, I know Ms. Wilson has given us some ideas as to how to say it a legal way, that we know this is substantial variance, we really don't like doing it, but because of the neighborhood and the unique conditions of the site and that part of the community, we're willing to go along with it. Can you help us craft language that, if we go that way, that would make it clear to the next person that there were unique conditions that are part of this variance?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we'd say something along those very lines. What I might suggest is perhaps taking an unofficial vote or straw poll tonight, and then we'll get you the resolution of approval. That's what you're so inclined to do, and you could see the language and be comfortable yourselves with it.
I'm always a very, very, very big listener of people when they show up, neighbors, right? And it sounds like, Peter, you may have heard from others that maybe think it's too big. They haven't shown up other than the planning board, not for nothing. The planning board clearly said it was too big. And everyone else has
Well,
said,
and all the people that told me they had issues didn't go to that meeting either. I think one did.
yeah.
And you and I know from past experience, like on Briary or Hillsdale or Allen or Palisade, what happens when the
They do come
community is really opposed.
They do.
We've all been in those.
I just want to say, I think I'm stuck on how we rule regarding the ambiguity. I think, I do think it's a fair point that this is an ambiguous language in the code. I do think that, I think the idea that should be interpreted in favor of the applicant is an idea that's rooted in due process and fair notice, and someone, an ordinary person reading this provision could really read it either way. I mean, it's not clear, but it doesn't clearly foreclose their argument. So I think I'm leaning toward feeling compelled to interpret it favorably to the applicant.
I agree with Jeremy, both from a legal analysis. I've read it for days and pretty certain it's ambiguous. And I think at least 3 members of the board would agree it's ambiguous. And I'm moved by the fact that in that instance, the applicant, benefit of the doubt goes to the applicant. I think you then take the next step where you apply the 5 factors, and I don't see a strong enough argument there to not grant variance either. So on both grounds, I'm leaning towards granting.
Maybe I'm a little confused, because I feel that if we're, like,
If we vote on the variance, we can.
We don't need to,
we don't-
right, but I'm
right.
telling you what's
Yeah.
guiding me from, I
Okay.
think Jeremy and I as the
Right.
lawyers on the board,
Yeah.
because counsel to the board doesn't want to take a view one way or the other. I think 2 lawyers on the board are saying, from a legal perspective, if you analyze the definitions on the screen, there's ambiguity there.
but does the issue of precedent with respect to the building inspector's history of interpreting this, does that weigh in, or does that get overridden by the fact that it's ambiguous, it needs to it needs to favor the owner?
I think that's a legislative decision. I think
Right.
the board is equipped to hear, what is the most beneficial interpretation, and to weigh the precedent and to clarify it in code. I think that is a legislative decision.
I agree. Or alternatively, somebody could challenge our decision. We're providing a basis for the decision, and if somebody wanted to challenge that, it could be heard in court. But either way, if you take the 5 factors or you take the ambiguity and rule in favor, me personally, I'm in favor of the applicant's position.
Yeah,
I would say, though, that the precedent, you have precedent of a large variance, just sitting on its own, a very large variance, versus a potentially ambiguous determination, not determination, but the language in the code.
Right.
I think there's probably more precedent setting with the larger,
Granting the variance with the
yeah, the larger variance.
deviation. Right.
Because that, variances can be, going to be everywhere.
Right, but that's why we're going to tie the conditions, right, in order to mute the effect. I think that's what we were saying.
But if you're deciding to go with the ambiguity and say that the code's ambiguous, you don't get to the variance, the applicant's good.
right.
The question in front of us, though, is not the variance, right? The question in front of us, as I understand it,
Either
is.
one.
Is
Alternative.
You have 2,
Yeah,
right?
it's
The
either
applicant has
one.
presented both to us.
Oh, okay.
Both questions are
And that
before
was
us.
done to try to save
All
some
right,
time.
okay.
I mean,
The thing that really bothers me is the size of the variance. It's a large house, but it's also an attractive house. And while there are some nice houses on that street, there are 2 particularly ugly houses on that street. And this would be an improvement, you know, in that.
I agree. Yeah.
You know, and I think that kind of tilts me.
The question though that I have, if we approve it based on ambiguity, is does that undercut the Department of Buildings' ability to interpret other situations analogous to this based on net square foot?
Only if the village board doesn't act.
Yeah, I think that gives the
That
board a
gives the
good
board a good
incentive.
incentive to.
Yeah, we may be able to get it through in 2 or 3 years.
I was gonna say, based on my many years working in government, government doesn't always move quickly.
Well, I think we're doing a
Got a member
disservice.
right there, Peter. I mean,
I think we're-
There's a history here.
I think
There is
we'd
a
be
history
doing-
here.
I think we'd be doing a disservice to the community if this board didn't say that this language is ambiguous and it
Yeah.
ought to be cleaned up.
Right,
That's true.
right, either way, okay.
And to go to the precedent concern, if, I'm happy to work obviously with your council, but in the whereas clauses, happy to maybe draft the longest variance approval you've ever seen, but in the whereas clauses, you can certainly put procedural history, the background here as to board member Passo's statement that, okay, we have all this going on, this vagueness, this ambiguity, and you look at the 5 factors, and you can put that in there without, you know, to help establish that or distance yourself from any potential second applicant coming before you.
I guess we're all saying we're gonna approve this pass going forward. And I guess the question I'm looking for your guidance from is the one that Peter asked earlier. From the protection of the village's standpoint, which is the best basis for us to approve it?
Well, you know, I've gone back and forth with that. I mean, I think I was really supporting Dan's determination. But again, you know, the language is unclear, or could be deemed to be unclear. You know, somebody had said something earlier that if that was upheld and there'd be nonconformities all over the village, that's that's the opposite of going to the Board of Trustees. So I'm not too concerned about that. But again, I think because it's such a large variance, that might be the worst of the two precedents, because, you know, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily, well, we can draft it any way we want, but somebody's going to say,
If you go with
I want variances like this.
it-
How long is it?
Patty, it's the fourth quarter of the Cavaliers right now, and the clock is ticking.
Site with an unusual extent of slopes. Very few properties are, ones I showed and all that, was really only one with five. So what you have is the idea that whereas the site coverage of the building coverage would be compliant were it not for the extent of the slopes, then that's, you know, that's the.
Well, but there are steep slopes.
Yeah, well, no, but again, if this property were 14.99%, there would be no question about it. Wouldn't be here. So it's
But it's
only,
not.
only the steep slopes deduction, there's vagueness in that needs to be fixed. You granted the variance based on that. That's the justification, and when we talk about how big the variance is, I like the way that Valerie wrote it. You know, again, it's less than what is permitted on a single lot. So it's, you know, the percentage, it's not like we're 50% coverage or something. The extent of it is not really, it's really not that different. The fact is that because of these other factors that makes it seem like it is, but it's still, it's a 9% difference to numbers, which if you do the math on it, I guess it's 9, well, I'm trying to do that in my head.
You know, one other consideration that it just sort of popped into my head is that, you know, you have a planning board involved with this, and this is going back to the planning board after this, right? So, you know, if you took the position that the code is vague, therefore we're not going to hear the variance there is no variance application, you know, by default, and they go back to the planning board and they deal with the planning board on things like the size of the house and other things. Granting the variance might pigeonhole them a little bit, you know, and make it difficult for the planning board to consider how the process goes, because they will have received the variance on, you know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Yeah, no, if,
I think from a policy perspective too, I'd like to rule on the grounds of ambiguity so that we get this fixed.
I think that's absolutely right.
Do you want to propose a motion, Joe?
I motion to grant the application based on the first application, which was that the applicant has presented a strong argument that the code is ambiguous, and in a situation where there's ambiguity, that ambiguity errs to the position of the applicant.
Second. All in favor? Yeah, and much as I would,
Oh, wait.
Just-
I think there was,
You got one down there.
there was a dissent.
I don't have to raise my hand. I'm gonna vote no on it, but you guys are gonna carry the day. I'm just not fully there, fully respect that position, and happy that it will move in a direction of getting fixed, and happy that actually, out of all the properties in the village, is happening on this one that can withstand a big building. People want it to be a big building, just scared to death of how this is gonna get leveraged against this board and the planning board at some point by some really creative developers out there. It's gonna happen, and I just know it's gonna come up. So, hopefully we can fix it and lock it down.
I still want to prepare a resolution. Perhaps the chair would want to receive it and review it on behalf, I mean, as opposed to saving it for another month.
I'd say send it to everybody,
Okay.
you know, make it a joint,
I just want to
joint
avoid,
project.
I just want the applicant to avoid coming to another
Yeah,
meeting, you know, we could do it outside, if that's acceptable.
is the public hearing also closed by that motion?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
but we've got another vote to make.
On.
No, you don't, if you,
We're done.
there's no
Oh,
variance.
okay, right,
That's
right.
it, we're done.
That's what-
That's how you've gotten out of setting any.
But you will
Just-
need-
it
you will
seems
need to
like
vote to close the hearing, though.
No, we've,
But I'm sorry, it seems like there's a disagreement. Are you suggesting that we need to wait to approve the resolution?
What I was suggesting is that the resolution would not wait, but I would distribute it to the whole board
Right.
and let me know if it's acceptable.
For editing.
And, yeah.
But that shouldn't hold up the applicant.
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Right,
okay, so
that's-
we're all on the same.
That's our normal process.
The vote's
You know,
valid.
The
Whether we
resolution
catch it or
is for the files.
Okay.
So we should close the hearing
Yeah.
as it relates to this application.
Move
Move
to
to close, second.
All in favor?
Close.
oh, bless the people who've been waiting for 2.5 hours, no, whatever it is. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I have no idea where the next one is. Oh, here it is.
You may be right, John. You may be right.
I hope I'm not right. I don't want to be right.
I don't trust it.
Should I plug into that?
It's gonna be a young Patty Sturge. He's gonna come here.
Yeah,
Do
That's
you
why we
have a
have to make sure-
statute you'd like us to interpret?
yeah. I didn't want to. Let's hope not. People having to just leave so the board if they find it knows the character of the neighborhood. Sort of.
Good night.
Hey,
Anyway,
I don't know.
it's very, very sound. The decision's very sound. I just wasn't quite.
I know how to fix it.
That means Pat's not going to be on the agenda next time.
Well, I'm not coming.
I'm sorry. So this next application is 4 Shady Lane, and this is property located in the OF6 zone requiring a variance for extending a non-conforming structure. The required minimum rear yard setback is 25 feet. There's a proposal for 17 feet 8 inches, so it's a required variance of 7 feet 4 inches. And while this is technically a rear yard variance, as you face the house, it is a side yard variance, or appears to be a side yard variance.
This young, talented architect is Mitchell Koch. I'm here really in place of my colleague Liz Vanderzand, who couldn't make it tonight.
Lucky her.
I'm here with Jennifer Boyd, the homeowner, one of them. And if you're familiar with this project, I'm going to keep it really short and sweet, hopefully. Essentially, what we're doing is providing a master bedroom and a master bath. And we're doing that as an extension on the north end of the house over an existing porch. And, you know, during the pandemic, we all learned the value of keeping open outdoor space, which is what we're doing. And we'll put some columns down. It's going to enhance the, I think the house. It's essentially a, it's essentially a kind of a Dutch gambrel roof house. And we're keeping that, and we're just adding a Dutch hip to kind of help with the sky plane on that side of the house. You can see it here. And basically, our entire house could fit into the variance.
Would you like to plant there?
Just saying.
You see?
You see, I'm a clever developer. Okay, you knew it was gonna happen. Addie, get back here. In any event, so we're just like throwing ourselves on the mercy of the court. This is a very de minimis ask. It does not invade the neighbor's space. We're actually just covering ground that is already covered with impervious with the garage. It's a handsome enough addition, and it doesn't really change the nature of the neighborhood at all. Jennifer, do you have anything you would like to add?
I do not.
Okay.
I wish I did.
Just one little point. You mentioned garage, and it's somewhere in here as well. I just looked at the place from the front. Is there an access way to the garage?
No, it's
an old garage.
It's an artifact
Yeah.
from another age.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can't get there from here.
I couldn't get there.
But, so there it is. I mean, essentially.
And neighbors were all notified?
Yes.
Want to see if there's
Anyone to be
anybody who
heard?
Yeah. Is there anyone in Zoom land that would like to contribute something?
Everybody went to bed. There were a dozen an hour ago.
Any questions here?
No.
I move to close the hearing.
Second.
All in favor? I move to grant the application consistent with the plan submitted. What that means is you've got to do it just like you proposed.
Will you promise?
Okay.
I'll second.
Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Should we just vote?
What-
All in favor?
Yeah, all in favor. Aye.
All right. Congratulations.
You know, I was gonna say to you at the very beginning, we should do this one first.
How did they determine this? The first one's gonna take